Now we're going to look at the second part of participles, and this is probably the most difficult section of the book. We're going to break it down, and it'll take some time to really master. But with some exercises, you should be fine. So you've done 5-4. Notice about 5-4, she asked, how were those? There are several things to discuss before we leave this exercise. Look at sentence 1. The participle phrase, the participle and any words that go with it, begins the sentence. So you have soaked by the rain. Soaked by the rain, that's our participial phrase. So we have soaked, which is the participle, and then by the rain. By the rain is a prepositional phrase, and what is it doing? Modifying soaked. So it's an adverb, right? Because it's modifying the participle. It's an adverbial modifier. That was the last part of the last section. It is followed by a comma. So right after rain, you have a comma. This is because there's a specific rule for this, a comma rule, that an introductory participial phrase is followed by a comma. So every time you have a participle that is then modified by an adverbial phrase, like a prepositional phrase, you know that it's an introductory participial phrase, and you're going to need a comma after it. Now, if you look at that sentence, soaked by the rain, what is soaked by the rain? Because participles are adjectives. Soaked by the rain, what is that modifying? Ask yourself, who is soaked by the rain? And that's Rex. So Rex is the noun that is modified by the participial phrase. And it says, soaked by the rain, Rex. So notice the comma. Another rule says, an introductory participial phrase must modify the very next noun in the sentence. The very next noun. Noun is the key word here. We're going to look at some errors, which we'll learn in just a sec. The dangling participle. So it must modify the next noun. So soaked by the rain must modify Rex. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem, and we're going to look at what that problem is. So what you're going to have is, if it doesn't modify the next noun, you're going to have what's called a dangling participle. A very, very bad thing. Big, big trouble. Big, big trouble if you've got a dangling participle. So let's look at an example. Running down the street, his shoelaces came untied. Now ask yourself, what is the participial phrase modifying? So the participial phrase, running is a participle, down the street. What is it modifying? You may think in the sentence, you think, oh, it's modifying his, right? That's what's intended. The person who's running down the street, it's his shoelaces that are coming untied. So you think, oh, it's modifying his, but it can't. It has to modify a noun, right? So to think that his is what's being modified is incorrect. The participle has to modify a noun. So the running down the street is actually modifying shoelaces. So what's running down the street? The shoelaces, right? Do you see those shoelaces running down the street all by themselves? That's what the sentence says. Here is another good one. Hanging over the side of the ship. So we have the participial phrase. Hanging is the participle. Over the side of the ship, prepositional phrase answering where. Right? It's an adverb. What's it modifying? You may think it's modifying his, but it can't modify a pronoun. It must modify the noun, the next noun, which is I. And so what's hanging over the side of the ship? His eye. There goes that eye, like a fried egg or one of Dolly's watches, right? So that is an important rule about participles. You want to avoid the dangling participle. And the mistake is basically this. You or whoever's writing it is assuming that this participial phrase is modifying this pronoun, this possessive pronoun, right? But this pronoun is acting as an adjective for I and as an adjective for shoelaces, right? Whose shoelaces? His. Whose I? His. And so the participial phrase can't modify it, okay? In terms of the meaning, sure, you may understand that you're referring to the person, but grammatically here, it's an error. It's a dangling participle. So you have to avoid that. Just be conscientious. Oof, can't speak. Just be conscious of that. One more thing. So another little thing about participles. Well, a couple more things, but the newly arrived package. Notice the hyphen. When an adverb modifies a participle that is in front of its noun, a hyphen often separates our adverb and participle. So notice all of the freshly baked bread. So we have a participle, baked. It's being modified by freshly, right? Which is an adverb, ly. That's what we all thought adverbs were before we started this book. And then we learned there are a lot more types of adverbs, but freshly is an adverb modifying the participle baked. Now, because baked is modifying bread, right? And then you have that adverb right before, you have to put these in a hyphen, usually. So freshly baked bread, plainly dressed woman, recently bereaved widow, etc. So that's, if you've ever seen these words hyphenated, that's the reason why. It's a participle rule. Now, sometimes a noun or adjective will modify a participle in this way. So homegrown. Home, right? What kind of word is that? It's a noun, and it's modifying the participle. It's a little strange, I know. And then there's a noun after it. Homegrown corn. Smoke cured ham. Ew. Newborn baby. Old-fashioned goodness. So goodness there, right, is an adjective. So old-fashioned. Fashioned is our participle. Old is modifying fashioned. And goodness, goodness there is a noun, but old is an adjective. So you have home and smoke, those are nouns. Home is modifying grown, which is a participle. You have smoke, which is a noun, modifying cured, right, which is a participle. And then you have new and old, which are adjectives modifying participles. So new is modifying born, old is modifying fashioned. Okay, and so you're gonna put hyphens between these as well. All right, now for the next somewhat difficult thing about participles. There's a very confusing thing about some participles. Remember that sometimes adjectives are predicate adjectives, right? The PAs. We've seen them before. So she was enchanted by his accent. How can you tell whether the sentence is, right? We have two ways of diagramming this. She was enchanted. Here it was enchanted is taken as a transitive passive verb by his accent, adverb, right? Prepositional phrase as an adverb. Or could it be she was is an intransitive linking verb, and then enchanted is a predicate adjective, but what kind of adjective is it? It's a participle. Which one is it? It's actually hard to tell. Sometimes you can't tell. You might have to tell through context, okay? It's a type of, it's a question, really. It's not always going to be the case that it's one or the other. The answer is you can't always be sure. So how do you tell the difference, though? If you can, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But how do you tell the difference if you can? You must decide whether the subject is really receiving the action. So is she receiving enchantment? Or is the past participle describing a condition, right? She was enchanted. It's like maybe a magician is enchanting her, right? Perhaps. She was enchanted. Maybe she was in love, and enchanted is being used that way. This is the condition that she is in, right? But again, you could turn both around either way. So you have to tell through context, or sometimes you just you just might not be able to tell. So it can be somewhat confusing. But for these exercises that we're doing, just treat most of them as participles. So that's a little difficult. Okay. Next thing. Don't worry, we're almost done with participles. So we have seen participles show their verbness by having adverbial modifiers. What other verb traits could participles have? Well, take a look. Raking the lawn, Tom found $1. Being honest, he returned it. Becoming a butterfly, the little creature grew beautiful. So raking is our adverb, right? Excuse me, our participle. Our participle. Being, participle. Becoming, participle. Now, raking the lawn. What is he raking? He's raking the lawn. So that is like a direct object, right? And so we're going to diagram it just like that. So you see that the participle is going to go under, just like an adjective, but now it has a direct object. No problem. It has verbness. Remember, same skills you learned earlier and before. You're just applying them. It's a little tricky, a little more complicated, but basically it's the exact same. Being honest. So we have being. Well, what is honest? Honest is an adjective, right? So these are all, so the verbs can take, the participles in their verbness can take complements. Same with becoming a butterfly, right? Butterfly, predicate noun. Becoming a butterfly, okay? So notice how they're diagrammed, just like normal adjectives with the curved line, because it's a participle, and they're taking direct objects, predicate adjectives, predicate nouns, complements, okay? Just like verbs. So that's that. Now, if we go on, okay. Here's one more construction that you've used many times when writing, I promise you. And this is the nominative absolute. The nominative absolute, right? It sounds quite strange, all right? But real verbs have subjects. Even gerunds have subjects. What could be the subject of a participle? Look at the sentence above. What or who did the raking? Right? Raking the lawn. And being and becoming. Tom, he, and creature, right? The nouns, the participles modify. So unlike gerunds, participles will not have a special rule about subjects. So raking the lawn, Tom, right? What was it? Being a butterfly, something like, or becoming a butterfly, he, right? So they don't have subjects, right? They don't take subjects. They modify, right? They modify the thing that is like a subject. In terms of meaning, it's like a subject. Except for the nominative absolute. One rather unusual construction is the nominative absolute. You may find a sentence in which the participle has its own subject, and the whole participial phrase seems to stand by itself. For instance, the work having been finished, the men moved on. So look, where's the participle? Finished. Well, what is finished? It's the work, okay? So this is kind of strange. Look, you have finished, which is the participle, and having been, these are actually helping verbs for the participle. So as you can see in yellow, gerunds don't have any helping verbs, but participles may. So the work having been finished, work is being modified by having been finished. But this whole thing, the work having been finished, this whole thing, it's called a nominative absolute. It's no relation with the rest of the sentence. The men moved on, no relation grammatically. Of course, in meaning it does, but not grammatically. So the main clause, the main independent clause is the men moved on, right? The work having been finished, you can see, is just above the actual sentence, okay? It's a strange construction, but you use it, I promise you, you use it all the time. And the key thing is that there is a participle in it. Now you may look at that and say, well, wait a minute, how do I know that that's not actually, how do I know it's not two sentences? Well, isn't there a comma between the two? If these were actually two sentences and a comma in between them, then you have another error, which is a comma splice, right? Okay, so that would be another thing. But the work having been finished, the men moved on. It's related. You can tell to the men moved on. All right. Nominative absolutes are a little difficult, but I promise you will use them in the future, and if you don't already use them now. Okay, so gerunds don't have any helping verbs, but participles may. So Tom raking the lawn, or having raked the lawn, having been raking the lawn, the girls thrown from the horse, being thrown, having been thrown, etc. Before diagramming some sentences with all kinds of participial phrases, let's see how really loaded down a participial phrase might be. Tom, diligently raking his uncle's weedy lawn with renewed enthusiasm because he had heard that someone had walked across the grass with a hole in his pocket, found $1. So that's a pretty intense sentence. Where are all the participles? Take a second, pause the video if you need to, and identify all of the participles. So Tom, diligently raking his uncle's weedy lawn. So we have our first participle, raking, right? It's modifying Tom. Diligently raking his uncle's weedy lawn with renewed enthusiasm. What kind of enthusiasm? Renewed. Renewed here, it's a participle, modifying enthusiasm. Because he had heard that someone had walked across the grass with a hole in his pocket, found $1, right? So those are the participles. Now, how do you diagram that? Give it a shot and see if you can diagram it. Remember, it has all the principles of what you've done before. So it may look difficult, but you've done it before. And it's not the best sentence, but it's grammatically correct. So you'll have to diagram 5-5. There's just one more thing about participles. All right. Okay, so you'll have 5-6, which is a mix of gerunds and participles. Before we leave participles, so this is the last bit. Oops. We should look at a troubling thing about some of them. As adjectives, they should stick to answering the adjective questions about nouns. But frequently, they seem to be telling where or how. Look at this. I saw him walking toward town, right? I saw him walking toward town. Walking there is a participle, right? It's modifying him. Toward town is a prepositional phrase modifying walking. It's answering where you saw him, if indeed him was the person doing the walking. Notice that this particular phrase might be interpreted as while I was walking, right? I saw him walking toward town. So in this sentence, I saw him walking toward town. Walking toward town could either modify him, right, or saw. If it modifies him, then it's the person, him, that's the person walking toward town. If it modifies saw, it's talking about you, the subject, I. You could phrase it like this: I, walking toward town, saw him, right? Both are grammatically possible. it would be better if you wanted to say that you were the I was the one walking towards town, you would actually move it in front. I, walking toward town, saw him, right? And you have to separate walking toward town there with commas. Okay, that's the end of participles. Those last bits are a little difficult. Okay, and trust me, once you finish participles, you're going to be really happy once you go to infinitives, which are a lot easier.